The views expressed by guests are their own, and their appearance on the program does not imply an endorsement of them or any entity they represent. Views and opinions expressed by guest speakers are those of the guests and do not necessarily reflect the view of Highline's Help for Abused Spouses or any of its funders, employees, or board members. The following podcast may contain discussion of domestic and/or sexual violence, stalking, suicide, and PTSD. There is also the possibility of strong language that may be inappropriate for young listeners.
Hi, this is Connie Huffman with Highlines Help for Abused Spouses. Again, we are talking about our staff and introducing them, and I am happy to have Angela Meyers here. She brought along with her this wonderful Wren, right? That's her name. I don't know how much she'll be able to contribute to our conversation today because I think she only weighs 3 pounds. But we're glad to have her here. And Angela, again, thank you for doing this. And I would like for you to start out by telling us a little bit about yourself and your background, how you became involved with Highlines Help.
Okay, thanks. I'm Angela Meyers, and my puppy is with me, Rennie. I began this work in 1997. I started working at the shelter in Great Falls, Montana, Mercy Home. And I worked there for a period of time when I was asked to do the children's group. And so I was facilitating a children's group and working at the shelter. And I found it very frustrating working with the kids just because they had not a lot of say in whether they could leave abusive homes or what they could do or how they could interact with parents and such. And many of them were just in the process of leaving their home and everything that they've had, everything that they've known and such. And so it was heartbreaking to do that work. So when Jeanette really was the woman who facilitated the women's group, and when she decided to retire from the group, I took over doing the group. And I found that much more satisfying working with the moms, because at least that way I could make a difference in trying to help them to find ways to leave or to stay and help their children or that kind of thing, because it was just too heartbreaking to watch the kids.
When you said take over the groups, in what capacity was that?
So I was a group facilitator. I would do the first hour kind of an education topic, and then the second hour was kind of like a 12-step meeting, like a support, and people would get to share what was going on with them briefly. And then we would meet every week for 2 hours.
Okay. And was this before you were doing actual counseling?
I was kind of in the middle of doing counseling at that time. I was trained as an addiction counselor, and I found being an addiction counselor, I have found myself working in addictions, domestic violence, and sexual assault for my whole working career, which kind of is overwhelming and negative in a lot of ways. But I definitely found the addiction world much more helpless and hopeless with relapse and treatment stays and then consequences and such. And so I found the work at the shelter to be much more rewarding. And so I was in the process of going back to school to get my master's degree at that point. And so I was doing addiction counseling. I was doing the support group and working at the Mercy Home.
Okay, so it wasn't just the nursing home people that you were working with, you were also working outside of that with addiction and stuff too.
Yes. So I was working at Rocky Mountain Treatment Center for periods of time. And so inpatient treatment I found to be really rewarding in the sense that you had people there for 30 to 45 days in treatment. And so while I was going to school to be a mental health therapist, I was also learning about post-traumatic stress disorder and anxiety and obsessive compulsive disorder that really go along with, and major depression that really go along with the domestic violence and sexual assault world. And so I found myself doing deeper processing therapy groups with people that were coming into treatment. And so my experience really boiled down to most of the women that I was working with at that point were addicted to some alcohol or drug as part of their connection in the relationship, or definitely something to try and cope with the trauma that they had experienced prior. And so that just pushed me forward into wanting to know how best to help them. And I figured that if I could get to the root of that problem, then maybe we could resolve some of the addiction issues.
And did that happen? Would you say what percentage of people that you think it helped with the addiction problem?
I think it tended to help probably more, 75% of it. I did see that abusive people tend to want to maintain that power and control, and they easily can by having a person who is addicted to some mood-altering chemicals. And so you would see as they were working on some of these past traumas and such that their chemical use would get worse for a period of time as they were going through kind of the therapy, and then it would improve.
So as they were going through it, while they were being triggered and causing them to want to medicate themselves to deal with it.
Yes. And so I became a licensed clinical professional counselor in 2004, and I have been doing co-occurring counseling since that time. I primarily work more in the victim-centered therapy, but there's always that addiction kind of in the background that we address. It was during that time that I was part of the Montana Coalition Against Domestic and Sexual Violence, and also just networking with different people when I came across Highline Help, and they had mentioned a need for a therapist or somebody to come and help some of their people. And I don't remember what year that was. I want to say about 7 years.
I would say that, yeah.
And I found it to be super beneficial. I know that I could actually work consistently up here every day, or at least a couple of days every week, but I choose to come up every other week. And I find that people really do appreciate outside therapists coming in to the community and other people not really knowing all of their business in a smaller town. So I find that to be helpful. I also just find it helpful because there aren't a lot of mental health therapists in Montana. It's hard anyways, but then rural Montana. And then also people who have both addiction and mental health experience is also limited. And so I found it to be very beneficial and helpful, and I enjoy coming here.
Well, we certainly enjoy having you, and you've been an incredible help to the program and an incredible resource for the program, because in our rural area up here on the Highline, why we do lack resources, and regardless of whether it's counselors or even counselors that have different specialties, and especially for kids.
Yeah.
That has always bothered me, is that we do not have the resources that we should have for the children that are going through the same kind of trauma. And do you see how it affects children? When you talked about that was what you started out doing at the Y, is children's group. And what did you find was the main issue with kids and how they were dealing with the domestic violence that was going on in home?
I think the hardest part with kids and dealing with that is I believe kids tend to see what's actually going on and actually know that it's not good to have parents together or people together that are combative and assaulting one another. And assaulting can also be just that emotional abuse, that yelling and screaming and fights in the middle of the night and different things. The kids were relieved and happy to be away at first. And so that was kind of the hard part, is that the first few days in the shelter, moms were on board with that as well. But then life gets really hard trying to maneuver the system and trying to find supports, find housing, find ways to get to work, transportation, all of the magnitude of issues that you have. And then feeling like the moms are feeling like they're keeping kids away from dads possibly, or other people who have been parental figures in their life. And so they're kind of ready to go back, and kids are torn at that point because many of them are wanting to stay because life feels really good. Also watching mom then become emotional, and so just kids feeling completely helpless, not really knowing. And so I think a lot of times kids at that point start talking about wanting to go back to what's normal. I think it makes it easier for people just to go back to what they've known. I think you see relief in the kids at first, and then you see lots of anger because they don't want to go back, and they don't want the communication that's actually happening. And then they're torn of whose side to take at that point. It's hard working with adults communicating what they're feeling at that point. And so it becomes even more difficult with children because they don't know what they're feeling. They just know it's not positive.
So what was the average age of the kids that you would work with?
It seemed like the average age of kids coming into shelter were going to be about the age of 4 to 9.
And so 4 to 9, so you have a 4-year-old trying to express their feelings as to what, because kids are very honest.
Yes.
They a lot of times say exactly what they feel and exactly what happens. And then the older they get, the more they start to hide certain things. So what is the difference between dealing with, say, a 4-year-old and a 9-year-old when you're counseling?
My experience with working with kids, and like I said, that isn't my main population anymore, is kind of just communicating at their level, wherever that level is, and sometimes throwing different games or activities into it to get them kind of distracted so that they can talk about their feelings. But really, it's just about kind of validating what their experience was, acknowledging that what they experienced, witnessed, that kind of thing has been really overwhelming and difficult and possibly traumatic for them. And then kind of just helping them to come out with feelings and really just being able to kind of express to their parent what they want to say. Many of them just find it very difficult. And so my belief is with all therapy is that all of us need a neutral place to come and talk about our emotions and things that are going on with us. And so that's kind of been my goal, is that with kids even, that here is your neutral place. You get to come and talk about your feelings, and when you're ready and want to speak with your parent, we can do that together, or we can come up with ideas of ways to communicate that to your parent.
Yeah, that kind of leads me into my next couple questions. Is, I guess the first one is, did you see a repeat very much where they would leave and go someplace, go back, and then they were back in the shelter and like a year later or something, and so these kids now are a year older? And what would be maybe the difference that you would see in kids the second time they came in?
The second time kids came in, usually you just saw more anger and frustration at that point, in the sense of how long are we going to be gone this time? When are we going back? When is she going to start communicating with them again? Is she communicating with them? And just being angry, but really it's being hurt, distrustful, helpless, not really knowing what that next step was going to be for those kids. And lots of times, well, all abuse stuff that I work with people on is a lot of grief. So lots of grief of saying goodbye to your home, your room, the things that are important to you, even if it's just a temporary removal. You see that grief with leaving schools or changing friends, coming to the shelter, finally feeling safe and able to talk with maybe the advocates and different things like that, and then leaving. And so you just see more anger and frustration, and really it's just a lot of fear and lots of pain.
Did you also at some point, and I would assume it depended on how long they were in the shelter at a time, be able to sit down with the children and the parent, be able to resolve some of these issues? Because I know a lot of times that kids also, they blame both parents, but they a lot of times will blame mom for either not leaving, or then when she does, then they're angry at her when she leaves. So were you able to get them together so that they could have a safe conversation? Did you do any of that?
I was new in the counseling world at that point, and it was also back in a time where they really weren't doing a lot of interaction with moms and kids. And so we didn't do a lot of that. As I facilitated the group with the moms for a longer period of time, I did try to incorporate that in. I did try to express to moms the damage and the effects of that, and just what it was like in the fact that they were going through this cycle, this tension, explosion, calmness. The kids would go through that same period with them, but in the beginning, they didn't understand that calmness. And so that's when many of them were full of anger and resentment with both parties, because they knew what was going on and were mad about the situation. And then there was this forgiveness component where the kids didn't even understand that. And so I tried to explain that to the moms so that we could have those conversations with the kids. Also just wanting the kids. So perception is really important with kids counseling. And so a lot of times their perception of what happened was different than what mom's perception of what happened. And so lots of times just we as humans want to get people to understand our perception, rather than just being able to put yourself in the other people's shoes. And so I really worked hard trying to get moms to just listen to what their kids were saying. And it was their perception that we were dealing with, whether that was accurate to mom or not. We wanted to validate the child's perception and then go forward with that. I think that's very hard on moms because there's lots of guilt to begin with for putting their kids in these kinds of situations, for staying in situations, for not leaving, the whole array of things. And so it's really hard to battle that guilt and trying to acknowledge what your kids are going through.
Children have a tendency to kind of have tunnel vision too. They don't process the way adults do. And we know that because their brains aren't mature enough. And then at a certain age, then as puberty starts in, then the brain starts to rewire, and then they have it's like kind of a brain explosion. They don't know. When you say, why did you do that? They say, I don't know. And a lot of times they don't. But the trauma, do you believe that the trauma follows them for pretty much the rest of their lives unless they have really been able to come to grips with everything? Do you think that this affects them into their adult life?
Definitely. And yes, and it's all different kinds of ways. Distrust of the world, distrust of families, distrust of relationships, leaving relationships like schools and different things. So definitely, and lots of times I don't even think kids are even aware that it's related back to that until some kind of event actually happens that really sets that trigger in motion, so to speak.
And that could be, 10 years later.
Yes.
Or 20 years later, that situation happens, triggers memories and stuff, and they're all of a sudden angry and they don't know why. So I think that what you're saying is that children go through this because they have to. They don't have a choice, and that it has a deep impact on their lives and how they perceive relationships to be.
Yes, very much so. Dr. Perry and Oprah wrote a book together, and Dr. Perry has done a brief video that I find to be very helpful about the effects of domestic violence on kids. And one of the most powerful statements that he said during that video is that the effect of witnessing your parents' abuse, whether it's physical or just verbal abuse, has such an impact on the kids that it's worse on them than if they experience physical or sexual abuse themselves. And I remember thinking that when I was doing the children's group, but there wasn't the brain science and information that had come out at that point about it. But that's really what you could see, is that here are these two people that I'm supposed to be able to trust and supposed to have this relationship with, and they're very mean to one another. And so how do I feel safe in this world when that happens? And so then you start seeing some of that anger and frustration and acting out behaviors and such. And you did mention the effects of that on mothers, and I think kids do tend to take their frustration out on the parent that is more frequently with them, but also the one that they have the stronger attachment relationship with, and so that lots of times tends to be mothers. Also, they know that this person's going to love them no matter how upset that they get with them. And so I think you see lots of those dynamics as well. And that's just very difficult on the kids, but it's very difficult on the moms who are already having a tough time as to, what am I doing?
Do you also see men that are being abused? Do you work with them also?
Yes, I do. And there are a good percentage of them that do come. What I find is many of them, when they present themselves into treatment or counseling, it's in for a different issue. But then when we uncover some of the layers, we find either abuse in past relationships or current relationships.
Well, thank you, Angela. That was very informative, and we are so fortunate to have you come up here every month, twice a month, and we also know that we can get a hold of you, and in between times, you are a very important part of our program. And also, I want to mention that because of some grants that we have to have project partners, and Angela is a project partner. And that just means that her part of the project that we do with our grant is exactly what she's doing, and that is coming up and counseling with our clients. And we could keep her busy all the time. She hasn't offered to move up here yet. Even she doesn't like the road. So we think that, in the wintertime that she should just move up here in the wintertime. But anyways, thank you very much. And I thank Remy for sleeping. And I believe that she's got a pretty good mommy. I think she's going to be a great therapy dog. We just want to play with her is what we want to do. So, but anyways, thank you very much. This is Connie Huffman again with Highlines Help for Abused Spouses. Be safe, be happy, and love life.